going to talk in this part about nutrient status. And this part of the model provides input to the control section to control nutrient intake. So for instance, someone can take a series of assessments or measures and get an idea of where their nutrient status lies. So in this part, we're going to talk about both nutrient excesses and toxicities and the measures or values that we use that are indicative of malnutrition. When we talk about nutrient imbalances or malnutrition, which is just an unoptimal nutrition status that impedes on the human body's functional capacities, when we talk about imbalances or malnutrition, they can be in the direction of both undernutrition or overnutrition. Either way, it's abnormal and it creates aberrant or abnormal values when we do assessments. Nutrient toxicities, or we talked about these in component 1, they're expressed as the upper intake level. So when we talk about intake level very high at the spectrum, in fact, so little that it's only for, 5% of the population or less, in these instances in long-term excess nutrient intake at that upper intake level, there are instances of chronic disease risk and increase in chronic disease prevalence and onset. So again, we're talking about a small percentage of the population, and most of the time, this level of intake is only associated with high levels of additives and dietary supplements. So in other words, consuming whole foods doesn't really elicit nutrient toxicities very often. Nutrient deficiencies. This is on, again, a very small percentage of the population in the United States. In fact, less than 5% of the population that would experience inefficient nutrient intake. However, this is a much larger population problem if we're looking at the worldwide population and if we're looking at all nutrients, again, in all types of countries. Now, when we talk about nutrient deficiencies, we move away from long-term and chronic type of case reports to more short-term, because when we're deficient in nutrients, it's a matter of days, weeks, and months before we start seeing functional declines, whereas nutrient excesses typically take longer to exhibit such, clinical signs and symptoms. So nutrient deficiencies are detected in case studies, and they're presented in a very small percentage of the population in the U.S. Nutrition assessments. So again, we're going to look at the different methods or the different measures and the instruments that we use and some of the different standards or healthy values, as well as those that are out of normal range or aberrant. Anthropometric measures most commonly are body dimensions and mass. We usually look at someone's weight, which you can see here is the standard for men and women. And we also look at that as a function of their height. So we really care about how much someone weighs only as a function of how tall they are. Because of course, the taller you are, the larger your mass to support that skeletal size. And that's why the BMI or body mass index is such a readily used clinical measure, because it's an anthropometric snapshot of a person's basic healthy body size and weight. We also look at circumferences, which we'll get into with other chapters, but circumferences of the waist and the hips and the arms and even the thighs and other areas are all indicative of changes in nutrition status, both good and bad. This is just to look at an example of how BMI is calculated for a 5'9" individual who's 150 pounds. And this is showing the conversion from inches to centimeters and pounds to kilograms, so that we could get a BMI of 22, which is right there in the middle of healthy. And just to look at what this would look like for a variety of people of different heights, you can see what their weight would correspond to create that ideal, perfect body mass index. And whether you know it or not, you've been evaluated for your body mass index whenever you've done a physical or even as a kid, being compared on a grid to other kids. All those growth standards are looking at a function of your weight to height. Body composition is also evaluated, and nutrition status can be measured looking at our composition of our body, which is looked at in a 2-compartment model. There's the fat component and the lean mass component. And the fat component can be measured by techniques, and our favorite is densitometry. And some people like to still get in the water tank, but some have moved to more air-based methods to measure the density of the tissues. But in the water-based methods, people submerge underwater, the fat floats, and we can calculate the percent lean mass based on the difference of total weight underwater. So these are just general ways that we can look at someone's nutrition status, and more particularly excesses. Usually we see excess body fat. We don't typically test for undernutrition status with these types of methods, but in a nutshell, we can look at the composition to assess nutrient status. We can also look at the 4-compartment model, which includes looking at fat compartments, both visceral and subcutaneous types, skeletal muscle mass, total and extracellular water compartments, and as well as bone density. Biochemical measures are also used to assess nutrition status, and we might collect biochemical specimen from a human that would include fluids, which are very indicative of nutrition status, and they're also less invasive. We collect blood and urine and feces and sweat and even samples from breath, as they do carry things that are indicative of nutrition status. The analytes that we would study in these biochemical specimens include fast and slow turnover things like nutrients, nutrient carriers, metabolites, enzymes, and inflammatory markers. We also can use clinical measures, things as like an expert looking at someone. And these are usually uncomplicated malnutrition things, but someone can even have their own perceptible feelings that let them know that their nutrition status is imbalanced, such as hunger and thirst, which we're all familiar with, fatigue and low mental stamina. We can also see declines in function, like say for instance, if someone has too much salt, they may have cardiovascular dysfunction or endothelial dysfunction. We'll talk about more about that in both the mineral and health chapter, but we can see those declines in function from those imbalances. We also see clinicians can pick up and judge changes in appearances that are indicative of nutrition imbalances that are expressed in, undesirable changes in hair, eyes, mouth, skin, nails, and even in the abdomen. We can also measure dietary intake or nutrition status by looking at what someone typically eats. And so clinicians often ask patients to do food diaries, food journals, and to keep track of what they eat. We also do things that are quick in clinic called food frequency questionnaires, just to get a sense of someone's nutrition status through their typical, weekly to monthly intake. So for instance, how many servings of yogurt have you had? You may be calcium and vitamin D deficient, etc. So those are the main methods that we use to assess nutrition status, and all of the ways that we can pick up if someone is imbalanced or eating too much or too little of a particular nutrient. And hopefully we use this back to the control component to set goals for healthy intake. That's all I have. Thank you for listening.